The town of Harrow's Creek was the kind of place that swallowed people whole and then forgot it had ever been hungry. Dust settled on everything here, on the wooden porches that sagged like tired shoulders, on the rusted tin rooftops, on the faces of men who had stopped dreaming long before their bodies had the good sense to stop moving. But more than anything, the dust settled on Margaret Elaine Voss, a woman of 42 who had lived in this town all her life and had somehow, gradually, completely, been rendered invisible by it. She sat every single morning on the same cracked bench outside the general store, a brown paper bag of groceries balanced on her knees, her gray coat buttoned all the way to the throat regardless of season, her eyes trained somewhere below the horizon as though she were afraid of what the sky might ask her if she looked up too long. People walked past her the way water moves around a stone, without pausing, without adjusting, simply parting and rejoining on the other side as if she were no more remarkable than a crack in the pavement. Children did not wave at her. Store owners did not greet her. Even the dogs that roamed Harrow's Creek seemed to carry their indifference as something inherited, as if their mothers had taught them, "That woman on the bench, she is not for you to love." It had not always been this way, though the years had done such a thorough job of erasing what came before that most people in town could not have told you when or why the change had happened. Margaret had once been a schoolteacher, 3rd grade, with a voice that carried warmth the way a fireplace carries light, not just to the person nearest it but into every corner of the room. She had laughed easily, married a man named Thomas Voss who sold livestock, and for 11 years they had built a life together on a modest property east of town. Then Thomas had gone, not to death, which might have been kinder in the way that finality can be a mercy, but to another county, another woman, another life, and he had left Margaret behind the way you leave behind the furniture that is too heavy to move, simply because starting over somewhere else seemed easier than taking stock of what you'd broken. She had not cried publicly. She had not raged. She had simply, as if following some ancestral instruction for how women in pain are supposed to behave, gone quiet. In the town, which had no patience for women who refused to perform their suffering dramatically or recover from it quickly, had responded to her quietness by pretending she was already gone. She had gone quiet, and the town responded to her quietness by pretending she was already gone. What no one in Harrow's Creek understood, what no one had ever taken the trouble to understand, was that Margaret's silence was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of someone who had been spoken over so many times that she had stopped trying to insert herself into conversations where her presence was clearly unwelcome. She still thought. Lord, how she still thought. She read every book the small library would lend her, returning them with the pages softer at the corners where she had lingered. She wrote letters she never sent, filling composition notebooks with observations about the light at different hours, about the way sparrows argued and made up within the same breath, about what she imagined her students were doing now that they were grown. She was not a hollow woman. She was an overfull woman with nowhere to pour herself out. And every morning, she carried that overfullness to the bench outside the general store, balanced it on her knees along with the paper bag, and waited for the day to be done so she could go home and be alone with all the things she was not allowed to say out loud. It was on a Tuesday in early October, a Tuesday that smelled of coming rain and old cedar, that a man came to Harrow's Creek who did not yet know its unspoken rules. He rode in on a dark roan horse, the kind of animal that commands attention simply by the unhurried dignity of its movement, and he had the look of a man who had traveled a long way and was not yet sure where he was going next. He wore a battered hat the color of dried earth, a denim jacket, and boots that had walked through enough different soils to carry a geography of their own. His name was Caleb Morrow. He was 50 years old, lean, with the kind of quiet face that does not reveal much until you study it long enough to notice that the quiet is not blankness, it is patience. He came looking for a man who owed him money and found, instead, a town that seemed to be holding its breath around something no one would name. He tied his horse outside the general store, pushed through the door to buy tobacco and a map, and on his way back out, he saw Margaret. He stopped, not dramatically, he did not gasp or stare. He simply stopped walking, the way a man stops when he notices something he wants to be sure he is seeing correctly. She had her eyes down on her paper bag, her hands wrapped around it with the careful grip of someone accustomed to holding things that might be taken away. And Caleb Morrow stood there on the porch for a long moment, long enough for it to be unusual, and he watched the town move past her, the women with their errands, the men with their opinions, the children with their noise, and he watched how none of it touched her. How she existed in a pocket of air that the rest of Harrow's Creek seemed to have agreed, without ever saying so, was empty. He tucked his tobacco into his jacket. He looked at her for another moment. Then he walked over and sat down on the far end of her bench, not crowding her, not invading, just occupying the same space the way you share a fire with a stranger on a cold night, and he looked out at the street beside her in silence for a full 2 minutes before he spoke. When he did speak, he did not introduce himself. He did not comment on the weather or the town or the horse or anything that men usually reach for when they want to sound like they are making conversation but are actually just filling silence because it makes them uncomfortable. He turned his head slightly toward her and he said, in a voice that carried no urgency, no transaction, no expectation of a particular answer, he said, simply, "What do you love?" Margaret's hands tightened on the paper bag. Her eyes came up for the first time in what felt like years. She looked at him the way you look at something you thought no longer existed. The question sat between them like something alive. Not what do you do? Not how are you managing? Not even the more advanced version of social courtesy, how are you really? Because even that question carries within it the assumption that the answer will be manageable, that you won't actually say the full terrible honest truth of how you are. This was something else entirely. What do you love? It assumed she loved things. It assumed she was still the kind of person capable of love, of preference, of desire, of the particular ache that comes from caring about something that cannot always be held. It saw her, not her grief, not her history, not the woman the town had filed away under the category of unfortunate and moved on from. Her, and Margaret Elaine Voss, who had not been properly seen in 11 years, opened her mouth, and began to speak. She said she loved birds. She said it almost apologetically at first, the way people confess something they expect to be mocked, quickly, quietly, with their shoulders braced. But Caleb Morrow did not laugh, and his face did not shift into the tolerant, glassy expression that people wear when they are waiting for you to finish saying your small things so they can return to their large things. He simply nodded, with the weight of a man who understood that what a person loves is the map to who they are, and he said, "Which ones?" And that was all it took. That single follow-up, "Which ones?" told Margaret that the question had not been a pleasantry. It had been a door. And she walked through it. She told him about the cedar waxwings that moved through Harrow's Creek each November in flocks so dense they turned the pyracantha bushes into something almost supernatural. She told him about the single great blue heron she saw each morning at the stock pond a half-mile from her property, standing in the shallows with the focused stillness of a monk at prayer. She told him that she kept a notebook. She hesitated before she said this, expecting him to find it strange. She kept a notebook of bird sightings, dates, weather conditions, behaviors she couldn't explain. She had been keeping it for 9 years. She had filled 4 composition notebooks. She had shown it to no one. Caleb listened the way that very few people know how to listen, which is to say he listened with his whole body turned toward her, not planning his response while she spoke, not waiting for a pause so he could redirect the conversation toward himself, but actually absorbing what she was saying as though it mattered, because to him, in that moment, it did. He had a sister who had been quiet the same way Margaret was quiet, after a marriage that had not been kind to her, and he knew from watching his sister's silence what it cost a person, what reserves of dignity it required, to keep yourself intact when the world had decided you no longer needed tending. He asked Margaret if the heron was always alone or if it sometimes had company. She said always alone, and then she caught herself and said she thought that was not a sad thing, actually, that she suspected herons preferred it. That solitude for some creatures was not a punishment but a preference, a chosen orientation toward the world. Caleb looked at her then, really looked at her, and he said, "Do you think that's true for you too?" And it was the kind of question that had no safe answer, and Margaret knew it, and she considered it with all the seriousness it deserved, turning it over in her hands the way you turn a stone in the light to see what it's made of. She had shown the notebook to no one. And yet here she was, offering it to a stranger who had simply asked what she loved. She told him she did not know anymore. That there had been a time when she had chosen her aloneness. After Thomas left, she had needed the absence of people the way a burned person needs the absence of heat. But she said that somewhere in the middle of those 9 years, the choice had been made for her instead of by her. That the town had stopped giving her the option of company so thoroughly that she could no longer tell whether she preferred her own presence or simply endured it because no other presence was on offer. She said this without bitterness. That was the thing that struck Caleb most, the complete absence of bitterness in her voice, as though she had composted it into something more useful a long time ago and what remained was simply clear sight. She saw her situation plainly. She had simply had no one to describe it to until now. Caleb sat with what she said for a moment, and then he told her a thing about himself that he rarely told anyone. He told her that he had spent most of his adult life moving, because movement had felt, for a long time, like the same thing as living. That if he kept arriving at new places, he didn't have to notice that he was not actually building anything or returning to anything or being known by anyone in the way that makes your life feel like it has a weight to it, a substance, a shape someone could recognize from across a room. He said that the man he was riding to find, the one who owed him money, he had stopped caring about the money about 200 miles back. He was riding because stopping had started to seem like something he owed himself, and he was not sure he knew how to do it. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally arrived, not dramatically but in the soft, persistent way that serious rains often begin, not announcing themselves but simply becoming present, the way a long truth arrives. They moved from the bench to the overhang above the store entrance, standing side by side watching the street empty out as people retreated inside with their umbrellas in their hurry. Margaret thought about how many hundreds of times she had sat under this same overhang alone, watching the same street empty out in the same rain, and how different, how completely, foundationally different, it was to stand beside another human being who had asked you what you loved and meant it. How such a small thing, one question, one act of genuine curiosity about another person's interior life, could rearrange the entire landscape of an ordinary Tuesday. She thought about the notebooks stacked on the shelf by her kitchen window, 9 years of careful attention to creatures that most people never really saw, and she felt, for the first time in a long time, that the attention had been worth something. That she had been worth paying attention to. That the herons and the cedar waxwings and the small meticulous recordings of their presence had been preparation for this, somehow. For being the kind of person who could answer the question when it was finally asked. Caleb asked her if she wanted to show him the pond where the heron stood. She said it was half a mile in wet grass. He said he had waterproof boots and no particular schedule. She almost said no, not because she did not want to, but because the wanting was so immediate and so large that it frightened her, the way the first warmth after a long cold can hurt before it feels good. But she thought of the notebook. She thought of the heron, alone in the shallows, choosing its own stillness. She thought of all the times she had been quiet not because she preferred it but because no one had made an opening, and she decided that when an opening finally appears after 11 years, the dignified thing, the brave thing, the thing that honors all the waiting, is to walk through it. She said yes. They walked together into the rain without hurrying, Margaret pointing out a sparrow hawk perched on a fence post with the particular excitement of someone who has been saving their observations for a very long time, Caleb asking the right questions, both of them moving through the wet October grass as if they had somewhere real to be and had simply, finally, found the way to start going there. The heron was at the pond when they arrived. It stood in the shallows exactly as Margaret had described, tall, composed, indifferent to the rain, performing its own version of perfect presence. They watched it together without speaking for several minutes, and in that silence Margaret understood something she would write in her notebook that evening and return to many times in the years that followed, that being seen is not about being loud or remarkable or in the right place at the right time. It is about someone deciding to look, and asking the question that makes looking honest. Caleb Morrow had not saved her. She had not needed saving. She had needed, simply, for someone to be curious about her inner life, to take the contents of her seriously, to treat her loves and her observations in her careful notebooks as evidence of a person worth knowing. And one cowboy, passing through a town that had tried to forget her, had done what no one else had thought to do. He had stopped. He had sat down. He had asked. And in asking, he had handed her back to herself.